Alright, Parker, this is part 3. This is of the 3 videos you sent me. This is the longest one, but coincidentally, it might be the one I spend the least amount of time on. You see, I have already, let there be light. I have already reviewed this one a few years ago for somebody, and I step by step refuted the points made in this video. I will leave these in both the description and in the Facebook comments when I tag you in on however many videos this takes. But well, let's see what they got to say. Okay? Okay.
I would like to present to you a case for the historical existence of Jesus. Lately, there have been many people who have been claiming that there is no evidence to verify his actual existence.
Alright, let me say this. What I always say to people is that it's doubtful Jesus ever existed. Jesus may have existed, Jesus the man. I highly doubt it. You see, to me it's irrelevant if Jesus existed or not. Christianity to me has about as much chance as being real as there is of me getting ash raped by a gang of angry Yetis in Sheol Mountain. You know what I'm saying? But to verify the existence of Jesus, why don't we first establish when Jesus was born? Now, this is what many Christians believe on the birth date of Jesus. So, let's see if we can establish when Jesus was born first.
What year was Jesus Christ born? The Bible does not provide the exact day or even the exact year in which Jesus was born in Bethlehem. But a close examination of the chronological details of history narrows the possibilities to a reasonable window of time. The biblical details of Jesus' birth are found in the Gospels. Matthew 2 verse 1 states that Jesus was born during the days of Herod the king. Since Herod died in 4 BC, we have a parameter to work with.
In the era of King Herod. That's very early AD shit right there, Parker. And the reason that's relevant is because to actually verify that Jesus Christ existed, what you need is a first-hand eyewitness account. And you don't have any in this long video. All you have to do is all these people that wrote about him or didn't write about him, and it was just said that they did, look at the timeline that they did it. Some of them were centuries after these would-be events. Some of them were a few years. But none of them, not even Josephus, was a first-hand account. Josephus is believed to be born 4 years after these would-be events, and that means his death. Josephus wasn't even alive in the entire timeline Jesus would have lived. So really you have nothing. In this long video you sent me, you have no solid, hardcore proof he existed.
In this presentation, we will be using only non-biblical evidence. In other words, we won't be using the Bible to prove the Bible. I warn you though, if you watch this video, you will no longer be able to believe that there is no evidence for the existence of Jesus, and you might even start to question the integrity of the research of those that have told you that there isn't. Cornelius Tacitus lived from 55 to 120 AD.
Matthew 2 verse 1 states that Jesus was born during the days of Herod the king. Since Herod died in 4 BC, we have a parameter to work with.
Okay, the ass clown that's doing the narration in the video you sent me warns that, you won't be able to not believe in Jesus after his video. He also says you'll probably question the integrity of the sources Well, according to the Bible, the first person he's credited is way too young to have been around when Jesus was alive. So is he trying to say that you can't trust the Bible?
Let's move on to Lucian of Samosata. Lucian was a 2nd century Greek satirist and rhetorician who scornfully describes his views of early Christianity.
Matthew 2 verse 1 states that Jesus was born during the days of Herod the king. Since Herod died in 4 BC, we have a parameter to work with.
Again, another one that's way too young to be around. So why don't we get to the closest one? The closest one that he credits is Josephus. He's older than everybody else, and he was almost around when Jesus was alive.
Next, we're going to look at Flavius Josephus. And before we get started on the details of Josephus, I'd like to make a personal comment. And that is that I've heard for a very long time that this Josephus quote was an obvious forgery. But if you look into it, you'll find that there are really only 2 different versions of this particular account of Josephus's talking about Jesus. He actually talks about Jesus in another account that's not disputed, but this particular one is. And what you'll find is that there's really 2 versions, and they don't really differ in anything important, at least when we're arguing Jesus' existence, because they both admit that he existed, that he was crucified by Pontius Pilate, that he had many followers, both Jews and Gentiles, and that he performed what Josephus calls wonderful works. I think one reason that this particular passage of Josephus has been singled out for accusations and even misinformation is that it's a very good account from a very prominent historian who lived at that time and would have probably interviewed the apostles themselves.
This talk is brought to you by the book Nailed. And if you really hate this talk, you're really, really going to hate the book. In fact, of all the eyewitnesses, the only one that could even be considered a near contemporary to Jesus is a Jewish historian, Flavius Josephus. And even he was born after Jesus' alleged death and wrote 60 years after that. We'll come back to him later.
Okay, for the remainder of this section of the video, I'm going to let David Fitzgerald, the author of Nailed, explain to you why Josephus never wrote about Jesus, and it was indeed a forgery.
But right in the middle of all these depressing little tales of woe, there's this. Now there was about this time Jesus, a wise man, if it be lawful to call him a man, for he was a doer of wonderful works, a teacher of such men as received the truth with pleasure. He drew over to him both many of the Jews and many of the Gentiles. He was the Christ. And when Pilate, at the suggestion of the principal men amongst us, had condemned him to the cross, those that loved him at the first did not forsake him, for he appeared to them alive again the 3rd day, as the divine prophets had foretold these and 10,000 other wonderful things concerning him. And the tribe of Christians, so named from him, are not extinct at this day. Now, funny thing about this whole thing sticks out like a Britney Spears video in the middle of a funeral. Let's just take a quick look at the highlights of these, and you tell me if you think this was written by a 1st century Orthodox Jewish historian or by a Christian forgery later. Look what he says. He calls him the Christ. He says, the 10,000 wonderful things concerning him, and he appeared to them alive again. So it's hard to believe that an Orthodox Jew, let alone a historian, wrote any of these things. Calling a criminal that was condemned by his fellow Orthodox Jews the Christ, a Greek word for the Messiah, and gushing over the oodles of wonderful things he did like a schoolgirl, and casually mentioned that, oh yes, he returned from the dead. Now, as an Orthodox Jew, of course, I don't believe he was the Messiah, but clearly, he was. And the tribe of Christians, so named from him, is not extinct at this day. Well, of course, there was never a tribe of Christians, and it's doubtful if Josephus would have made such a mistake. But the term Christian wasn't even used until the 2nd century, and Christianity didn't even get tribe-sized until well into the 2nd century. It was just scattered in unorganized communities at that time. And he says, as the divine prophets had foretold, but normally careful historian Josephus doesn't mention who these prophets are or what they said, which is very unlike him. Another subtle indication of forgery that's not apparently obvious is the mistaken use of the word Gentile. It just so happens that Josephus, who is writing for a Roman audience, never uses the word Gentile in any of his writings. For instance, throughout Antiquities of the Jews and the Jewish Wars, he'll refer to non-Jews as Greeks or Syrians, regardless of their actual ethnicity. And incidentally, I had a Christian friend of mine who called me on this and said, no, Dave, in my edition of Josephus, he always calls Gentiles. And I said, really? You're kidding me. What edition do you have? The Penguin Wisdom edition. I said, that's the exact same edition I have, and you'll have to show me where that was. He never could. So Josephus would have been extremely interested in Jesus casting out the money changers from the temple. But he makes no mention of that. That's just the kind of story he liked. Because he spends pages and pages documenting the antics of other lesser loser messiahs and miracle workers in great detail. Not to call him a loser, but John the Baptist, Judas of Galilee, Theodas the magician, a Jewish messiah called the Egyptian, all of whom he rebukes as deceivers and impostors, and he has nothing good to say about any of them. In fact, pointing out uppity Jewish would-be messiahs is kind of a special focus of his. But this lone little snippet is all he has to say about the guy who's the real deal. He spends longer time describing the tawdry little sex scandal in the next paragraph than he does in any of this, describing who he thinks is the actual Messiah. And in fact, the reason that Josephus didn't like any of these miracle-working messiahs is that he spent his whole career declaring that his patron, the Emperor Vespasian, was the actual Messiah. And lastly, the very next paragraph after this suspicious little passage starts by saying, at this time there was another sad calamity. Sad calamity? We just saw a commercial for Jesus. What's sad calamity? Okay. Stopping beating the dead horse here. In light of all this, really no historian argues that it's not a forgery anymore. The only argument left anymore is how much of a forgery it is. And Christians try to insist that, well, it's only a half forgery, that Josephus really wrote something and some monk in the Middle Ages tried to fix it up. Well, if that's true, how come the next paragraph ends that way? But here's the real kicker. The passage itself doesn't even appear until the 4th century. Earlier Christian church fathers and apologists, like the church father Origen, like Clement of Alexandria, were constantly using Josephus in their ammo against pagan debates. They would have given their mothers for a nice ace in the hole like this, but they never do. But somehow in the 4th century, it starts getting quoted by this man, Eusebius, bishop of Caesarea. Let's just take a second to get to know him, because I'm convinced most people have never heard of him, and yet he is responsible in a large part for the Christianity we have today. And I think Christianity owes a huge debt to this largely unsung, tireless, illustrious, lying son of a bitch.